Welcome to Brandywine Online. I'm Mary Cronin, the Director of Audience Engagement for Brandywine Museum of Art. During today's program, we invite you to add questions or comments using the Q&A function or the chat feature, whichever one is easiest for you, and we will take some time at the end for discussion. We are recording the program, and we will be sending the link to everyone who is registered in about a week's time. We go through and we do edit the closed captions before we send that out. Our program today focuses on two artists and their studios, Wharton Esherick and N.C. Wyeth. Esherick's work is currently featured in an exhibition at Brandywine Museum of Art through January 19th. And N.C. Wyeth's home and studio are a National Historic Landmark that is operated by Brandywine and open for tours this season through November 24th. Those tours will resume for next season in April. Leading today's discussion are Dr. Amanda C. Burdan, Brandywine Museum of Art Senior Curator, and Emily Zilber, the Wharton Esherick Museum's Director of Curatorial Affairs and Strategic Partnerships. I'm now going to turn this over to Amanda and Emily.
Hey there. Welcome, everybody. Emily is going to be running our slides today, so I feel helpless on this end. We're at Emily's mercy, but Emily and I have had a great time working on this, not just this project in general, but finally getting to dig into some of the research about these two artists that we each steward the house and the studio of, and realizing how close they were proximity, how close they were in age, how close they were in the illustration world. And so we wanted to start that conversation here today. And Emily, I think you and I both hope that somebody else will be sparked to go forward and do some even more digging, maybe someone at the one of our institutions or locally, because I think there's still a rich story left to uncover.
I think what we have discovered in exploring the lives of these two artists, we sort of started out thinking about this program to talk about the parallels in their individual careers because there were many. And what we have uncovered and what we've begun to explore is these more significant connections. And it's just been really interesting to see how, though they're very different, there's so much overlap and there's so many connections between them. It really makes me thrilled, again, as I always am, to have the Esherick exhibition at the Brandywine. It really just sort of drives home the point that it's the right place for Wharton Esherick's work. So we're going to go through today, we're going to talk about a couple of different themes where there are points of connection between Wharton Esherick and N.C. Wyeth. And then we'll, as Mary mentioned, we'll leave some time for questions and conversation at the end. And I think, when we were first beginning this conversation, we were just really struck by the similarity in life dates and biography for the two artists. So Esherick is born in 1887 and passes in 1970, and Amanda, NC's dates are
not 1886, which I always say 1882 to 1945. So just a few years difference. Now we many know that N.C. Wyeth's life was cut short by an accident. So Wharton Esherick does go on long into the 70s. Makes me wonder what N.C. Wyeth would have done in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s even.
Exactly, but they had similar sort of upbringings temporally. I'm showing here two images from Wharton Esherick's sort of upbringing. He was born to a relatively well-to-do family in Philadelphia, lived in West Philadelphia. Here on the left, he's there with his siblings, and then on the right, I love this photo of them camping in the Poconos, and you've got that tent in the background, even though they all look very, I don't know, I've never gone camping in this kind of attire, but they look very put together for camping. And, Esherick went to, he was determined to be an artist from a young age, studied woodworking and metalsmithing at the Central Manual Training High School in Philadelphia, and then drawing and printmaking at the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art, which later became the University of the Arts. In the class of 1908, he's in the back row, far right. He later went on to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where he entered the sort of 2-year painting program, although he left that 6 weeks shy of completing his certificate there, and began his sort of career. He gradually marries and starts his own family, and I'm showing on the right here, Mary, his daughters, Mary and Ruth, his wife Letty and Wharton, in the early 1920s.
Wow, they're still kind of camping pretty fancy.
Still camping fancy, exactly.
So I don't have any baby pictures of N.C. Wyeth to show you, but I wanted to pick up, sort of like Emily said, he decided pretty much at a young age, by 12 years old, N.C. was really set on being an artist, of pursuing art training. So he attended the Mechanics Art School. He's born in Needham, Massachusetts, right? So he's not from here. He attends the Mechanics Art School and he's learning the principles of drawings. As you know, he could have been an engineer with these skills. But then he goes on to go to the Massachusetts Normal School, which now is known as the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And then for further specialized study with Eric Pape at his school in Boston. So it's there that he meets a friend, Clifford Ashley, who said, there's this Howard Pyle, he's teaching in Philadelphia at Drexel, but he's starting his own school in Wilmington, and he's really focusing on the art of illustration. So with his friends, N.C. Wyeth decides to move to Wilmington to attend these schools in the fall of 1902, to come down to Wilmington. And then Howard Pyle, who was this renowned illustrator at the time, not only renowned for his own illustration, but for being able to teach students illustration and get them jobs in the field, to get them connected. And he ran a special summer school out in Chadds Ford, where our museum, the Brandywine, is located. So I have historic photos here of Clifford Ashley, Henry Peck, N.C. Wyeth is second from right, looking like jaunty young men on the streets of Wilmington. And then out here in Chadds Ford and the summer school, and that was a select summer school that was only for invited students, the best of the best. NC is not in this picture, but all of his classmates are that summer in 1903. 1903 summer is the first time that NC gets a publication. We'll look at that as well. So he has gone through a lot of different kinds of art training and has landed here in the world of illustration in the early 1900s. There you go. And then it's not long, and we'll explain the path, but his visits to Chadds Ford turned into a love of Chadds Ford. So he decided to build his own house and studio here in Chadds Ford, where he raised his family, his very, very artistic family. And you get a family portrait here, sort of like what Emily showed us in 1921. This is what the Wyeths were doing, NC in the center, his wife, Carolyn Bacchia, seated, his daughter Henriette on one side, Carolyn on the other side, Anne on one side of mom, little Andrew on the other side of mom, and Nat Wyeth in the other chair. So a very creative family. Had already built his own art colony amongst his kids. There you go, Emily.
Well, I think that sort of path out from the city to Chadds Ford is another point of connection that we found between these two artists. This sort of desire to move from this art school environment into a more kind of rural lifestyle where the focus could be on cultivating one's art, one's skill. For Esherick and Letty, they moved out to Valley Forge Mountain, and they settled in a 19th century farmhouse on the slope of the mountain. They called it Sunnycrest for its southern exposure. There's a picture of Sunnycrest on the right there. And they really began an experiment in homesteading. These are two people who were raised in an urban environment and decided that they wanted to sort of live in an organic way, go back to the land. They're on the left, in the gardens under the grape arbor at Sunnycrest in the mid-teens. They kept bees, they raised animals for meat. Esherick was painting at that time. He sort of still had not begun to really delve into three-dimensional work and furniture when he first moved out to the country. But even after he began working with wood carving blocks, the house, Sunnycrest, was still a point of artistic inspiration for him. And so a painting from the 1920s where he's depicting the farmhouse, and then this fantastic woodcut December, which I think hopefully we'll see if our December is like that, coming up soon, made in 1923, but featuring the front of Sunnycrest. They also worked in the land there. So Letty had a peony farm. She taught dance. And so here, this fantastic image of sort of people in amongst the peonies, and then Esherick's wood on this advertisement for the peonies from Sunnycrest Gardens in Paoli, Pennsylvania.
So when I heard the story about the Eshericks deciding they would be peony farmers, it reminded me right away that N.C. Wyeth came from a family of flower farmers as well. This is his grandfather, Dennis Zerngibble, in Needham, Massachusetts. He was known as the Pansy King. He had immigrated from Switzerland, and he was working at the Harvard Botanical Gardens and developed these giant pansy breeds. So at a time when NC is maybe feeling a little homesick and doubting some of his decisions, and late in the teens thinking maybe I should go back to Needham. Let's move the family back to Needham. I think he came face to face with his possible future as a pansy farmer, because Needham was still where the Zerngibbles were known for their pansies. And in fact, his plans there were to adopt some of the agricultural buildings for a studio. Eventually, he changed his mind and came back. But I just thought it was really funny that they both had these flower farms in their backgrounds.
Truly a really interesting point of connection. I wanted to show you this, to get folks out to see Wharton's art, to see the flowers that were growing. This is an example of an exhibition invitation that was dates from the early 1920s. You can see that Esherick has sort of expanded from just illustration and painting. We've got pictures, oils, watercolors, sculptures, wood carving, furniture, decorations, prints, woodcuts, anything. Inviting you out to the studio, showing in this blow up of the map that I placed on the right, the sort of direct route to Paoli, 20 miles from Philadelphia. Esherick is 3 miles from Paoli. So once you've gotten to the train, you still have a little ways to go. And then the sort of expanse of the Great Chester Valley that will meet you when you make your way out to the studio to sort of peruse some of what Esherick has to offer.
Emily, I didn't put a slide in for this, but it's maybe goes without saying that N.C. Wyeth's site of his home here in Chadds Ford was also very proximate to the train lines, right? You could walk to the village from his house, and we still have Station Way Road that we use. And, the train station became a Wawa and then a post office. But eventually, this proximity to the cities with the railroad was really important for both of them.
Well, and for Esherick, it's why he sort of settled out there. He had originally wanted to go to New Hope, where there was a sort of robust artist colony that some of his teachers at PAFA were connected with. He was priced out of that area, but they had just extended the main line out to Paoli, where the head of the railroad lived. And so this was this new place that sort of hadn't been developed. It was mostly farmers. Artists hadn't cottoned onto it yet, but they could have this train back into the city in this kind of easy way. So railroads played a big role, I think, in their ability to sort of move and have this kind of rural artistic lifestyle.
Yeah. So now on with N.C. Wyeth, we knew he came to Chadds Ford because this is where summer school was with Howard Pyle. He started after he married Carolyn Bacchius in 1904, I think, early 1904. They settled in Wilmington first, But I mean, even Wilmington was a little bit bigger of a city compared to rural village of Chadds Ford. They started renting a house soon after on Chadds Ford that had a studio, or had a barn that he turned into a studio. Sounds familiar, Emily. And he started, well, he was working there through his commissions. And I'm showing you this end papers from Treasure Island of 1911 because maybe N.C. Wyeth would have been priced out of even Chadds Ford had he not received this commission to do 17 paintings for the Scribner's Classics reissue of Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. Those 17 paintings and that reissue became instant classics. And he took the commission for doing that work, which he accomplished in the Renan studio, and he purchased 18 acres on Rocky Hill. I love it. We have Diamond Rock Hill and
Diamond Rock, yep,
and
exactly.
Rocky Hill, that they each located this chunk of land that they could claim and call their own. N.C. Wyeth was able to purchase it, and go on to the next slide, Emily, and build there starting in 1911. By the fall of 1911, the foundation was poured for the house that you see, the N.C. Wyeth house there. I'm showing you from the front. There was an extension onto the back that was going to be able to accommodate his growing family. But he kept it among the woods, the trees, the rocky landscape, up on an outcropping so that he could look down and see the village of Chadds Ford below. I'm showing you the image on the right-hand side, which is a dining room that was put on, or a breakfast room that was put on in an addition in about 1926. And this is as close to N.C. Wyeth gets as N.C. Wyeth gets to doing the kind of spatial design and planning that Wharton Esherick becomes known for. This breakfast room was something that N.C. drew out and planned and designed to feel like the interior of a ship, right? A classic New England feeling to this Pennsylvania country home. And we always talk about that table that he designed as well and hired somebody to make. How it was meant to fit this really large family, and they all lived and worked in such close quarters, especially in the dining room. And then if you go on to the next slide, Emily, the studio was begun also in 1911. So this was a big commission to allow him to purchase 18 acres, build the house and the studio. This is just above the house, even higher up on the hill. So his commute was to walk up the hill to the studio. You see the steps leading up there. I'm showing you the view of the studio on the left. That large central section with the Palladium window was part of the original studio built in 19. What you're seeing on the far left, the windowed extension, and you can see just inside the view as well in the interior photograph, is a mural studio that was built in also late in the 1920s. I remember how I said he went to Needham to say, maybe I'm going back to my family. Well, his recommitment to come to Chadds Ford came with an expansion to the house and the studio. So he really doubled down and said, I'm really staying here. The family is staying here. This is where we belong.
So that's interesting. So both men sort of had the family home and then built the studio as a sort of separate space from it, although it took Esherick until the 1920s to manifest the first part of his studio. But that sort of dual consciousness in terms of where living and working is certainly something they have in common.
Yeah, they're the original work from homers.
Exactly. So we show this image because truly, looking at these visuals between N.C. Wyeth and Esherick painting, just years apart from each other. There's so much similarity here in the sort of rural landscape, the Pennsylvania landscape they're depicting. This is a painting, Ripening Wheat, that Esherick showed at an exhibition at the Babcock Gallery in 1921. And just a review from the Philadelphia Public Ledger stated that the painter knows trees and is fond of them is also revealed. Perhaps the gem of the collection is a green patterned panorama of Chester Valley entitled Ripening Wheat. The contrast between the tawny wheat fields and the silvery green of the oats not yet ripened, and all the other variations of verdure at the very height of summertime, is well handled. So here he's getting these kind of praises for being able to depict the nature, the rural life around him. I also wanted to include this because this is at a time when Esherick is still working as a painter, but he has taken that sort of fateful trip that has introduced him to carving tools, to working in wood, and he's begun to create his own frames. And so what we know is that this exhibition is an exhibition that seems to have introduced the Wyeth family to Esherick as a frame maker. And we know that in Esherick's biography, which was written by Bob Bascom, his son-in-law, and one of the founders of the Wharton Esherick Museum, he writes that Andrew Wyeth recalls NC taking him to visit Wharton to look at frames. There's no record of them ever having commissioned or purchased anything from Esherick, but these are the kinds of frames that Esherick was making when they might have been having those points of connection.
Excellent. You know, you think, go back just a second, Emily. The image by N.C. Wyeth is not one that people would often affiliate or associate with his style of illustration. And this is kind of a continuing story throughout his career, that there are work paintings and there are personal paintings. And this really impressionist view of Chad's Ford, I mean, not only does it look like Wharton Esherick and N.C. Wyeth should be painting side by side out in a field somewhere, but one of the things that, as I was listening to your description, Emily, I was like, well, except for the wheat growing, the description matches NC's
difference
as well. And the notice of the trees, one of my favorite parts of this NC Wyeth painting, which I think is on view right now, is that shadow of the great tree that's in the foreground. Trees, obviously, with what Wharton Esherick did for a living, trees were very important. But I think if you pay attention to N.C. Wyeth's paintings, the trees were these mighty anchors in many, many of his works. Now you can go on to that next good frame story.
Great. So we've got this frame on the right, which is Moonlight on Alabama Pines, is in the exhibition at the Brandywine, and really shows Esherick sort of delving into thinking about creating carved frames where the iconography of the frame often references the sort of content of the picture. Here we've got these clusters of pine needles, and then they're surrounding the sort of landscape of Alabama pines. Very different from the frame that we see that N.C. Wyeth commissioned.
Yeah, so I imagine if N.C. Wyeth did go out and see Wharton Esherick's frames, he might have been like, that's not at all what I was thinking of.
Yes, a little, not quite elaborate enough.
The image that I'm showing you here on the left is a frame that N.C. Wyeth commissioned by the Wilmington frame maker Frank Call for a very specific painting. I'll give you that in a second, but I just want you to look at how, you know, in one way, Wharton Esherick is being kind of literal, showing the same tree that is pictured in the painting is echoed in the pattern on the frame. N.C. Wyeth has these almost like, well, they're caryatids, but in a second, you're going to see how they relate. You'll see there's also an anchor with down at the bottom in the central medallion, and then there's two cats by the side, and a seashell up above. I have no idea what the cats are doing. I got to figure that one out yet. But Emily, can we show them the historic photo of the painting that was in this? So the painting was Duel on the Beach, which was a commission, but then went on to have a life with a very wealthy collector who was putting it in a very public place. So the frame really made the painting. N.C. Wyeth wrote about how excited he was. He literally says something like that. It really makes the painting. And those caryatids now become, with this pirate theme, more like ships figures on the front of the prow of a ship. The anchor and the seashell makes sense. The cats still don't make sense to me, but they are down at the bottom there. So this is a painting or a frame that the Brandywine does own, and we've been able to restore it over the years. That's why it looks so shiny in the way that it was displayed. And if you visit the studio, you will see it. We don't own the painting that was once hanging in it, and it was in a private collection. But recently, earlier this year, I received some communication from a very important person who had recently purchased the painting and had learned that this was the original frame for it, and is working on having a replica frame created so it once again can be seen in its intended frame. And I know it's going to happen because the person who owns it is George Lucas. It'll probably end up in his Museum of Narrative Art. And believe me, I asked if we could possibly borrow the painting so that we could show it in the original frame here as well. So they're both thinking about the way that the frame and the frame's iconography complement the painting, but they're doing it in kind of different ways at the same time.
At the same time, exactly. Yeah. So we've largely sort of had these thematic connections. We're going to shift to talk about some of the sort of clearest biographical connections that we found between the two artists, and that's through their involvement in the Chester County Art Association. I'm showing here the logo for that organization, which NC Wyeth designed. CCAA was founded in 1931 by artists including NC Christian Brinton, who we see in a portrait by Horace Pippin on the left. Pippin showed at the CCAA, and William Palmer Lear. The aim was to promote knowledge, enjoyment, and cultivation in fine arts through schools and instructions, books and publication, and the establishment of a gallery. And so we have here the Chester County Art Association Articles of Incorporation on the left. If you can see where I put these red boxes, the vice president is NC Wyeth. And then there's a list of names of folks who sort of were a part of that. And we've got Mr. Wharton Esherick down here. And then on the executive committee, this is another board of directors executive committee list in 1933. We have Mr. Wharton Esherick, Paoli, Pennsylvania, as a sort of part of the group here with Mr. NC Wyeth. So we know that they were a part of this together.
And historic newspapers are all of our friends because we started searching and found actually a plethora of times and places when NC Wyeth and Wharton Esherick were exhibiting together at the same place. Now we focused just here for today's presentation on the Chester County Art Association. When the publicity came forward and the group had its true foundation with a charter going forward. You can see once again, it's not like either one of them fell out of the planning committee by 1933. You see both Christian Brinton, as Emily mentioned, and NC Wyeth of Chad's Ford are part of the subscribers. And then the directors are listed below. You see Wharton Esherick of Paoli. And if I had included a little bit further down in the article, you would have seen Mrs. Peter Hurd, which is to say NC Wyeth's daughter, Henriette Wyeth, was part of this as well.
In our archives at the Wharton Esherick Museum, we have this fantastic correspondence between Esherick and William Palmer Lear from the Chester County Art Association, in which they're sort of going back and forth about Esherick teaching a class for the organization. Esherick's handwriting is wonderful, but a little hard to decipher. So I'm gonna just read you what that letter says on the stationery with this fantastic woodcut sort of design up at the top. So he says, "Dear Mr. Lear, if possible, I would be glad to join in with the sketch class in Westchester. Maybe I can help with criticism by doing. Thank you for remembering me. Give me notice when it gets underway. Sincerely yours, Wharton Esherick." And so this is in 1932, before those articles of incorporation. We don't know if he ever ended up teaching at the center. We know about his involvement, but I love this craftsman questionnaire that the American Craft Council put out in 1958, where on the second page, he still lists his memberships and organizations, including the Chester County Art Association, past experience in the educational fields. He lists that he taught in Fairhope, Alabama for a year, but he is not interested in giving lectures or demonstrations. That is off. He's no making himself available to teach or to do any kind of instruction. And so it seems as though, the director mode was sort of where he he focused his energies when it comes to working with the Chester County Art Association.
You know, and that's not unlike NC Wyeth. Despite the fact that it is the large studio, he attended the normal school. He's attended a lot of classes with wonderful teachers. He never held a school on his own. He did take a few pupils, almost more like apprentices. And frankly, they tended to marry into the family at that point, too. The artist Peter Hurd was someone who came out to Chadds Ford as he was studying at the Pennsylvania Academy, introduced himself, wanted to learn from Mr. Wyeth, ended up marrying Henriette Wyeth. But the two, Peter Hurd and Nancy Wyeth, did work together on illustrations, sort of like a master and an apprentice situation.
Yeah, and that's very similar to the way that Esherick worked with folks who were eager to learn from him. People had to make pilgrimages. He often told them no. And this is not a person who sort of wanted to be thought of in that way as a sort of public-facing educator. But yeah, we have this involvement with this organization. And so I'm showing here the program from the Chester County Art Association first annual exhibition. We've got NC is not only the vice president of the organization, but he's on the hanging committee. We have lots of Wyeth representation in the first gallery here. So Carolyn, Henriette, and NC. And then if we go on to the second page, more Wyeth, sculpture by Wharton Esherick, including Speed, which is in the exhibition at the Brandywine now. Wharton Esherick has also showed a piece called Bird in Ring. And then in the entrance hall, we have furniture and sculpture by Wharton Esherick. And so it's fascinating to see all of this sort of fantastic work that would have been displayed together in this exhibition, and to show some of those pieces together here. So Speed, the piece that's at Brandywine, Bird and Ring, which is a that's a fantastic historic photograph, and then surrounding In a Dream I Meet General Washington, which was one of NC's contributions to this show.
Yeah, and I think looking broadly at what NC contributed to this show, it was not, as he would have shown maybe in Wilmington, at the Wilmington Society of the Arts, especially the exhibitions that were dedicated to honoring Howard Pyle, he was showing illustration there. Here at the Chester County Art Association, he was showing a different side of his talent, the more imaginative paintings, the fantasy paintings. I didn't bring examples of what Henriette was painting. She was doing very fantasy-based work at that time and showing it, really inspired by Marie Laurencin. And you may have seen one of the titles was something about a witch, and NC is also loosening up here and showing a more modern, a more imaginative and fantasy-based side. And on to the next slide, if you would, because there were a number of NC Wyeth paintings, but when I pulled them all out to look at them together, 3 of them stuck out: Old Albert, John McVeigh, and Pennsylvania Barn, which all done around 1928, and it's a time of experimentation for NC Wyeth. We often show, not often show, but I have grouped together right now in the gallery at Brandywine a later 1930s set of more modern and forward-thinking Maine-based paintings. But this is a really solid group of Pennsylvania subject matters. So like Wharton Esherick, like probably a lot of the other Chester County Art Association members, they're looking at their surroundings, their personal environments, where they are, and incorporating that into their artwork. And these are 2 neighbors, John McVeigh and Old Albert, and Pennsylvania Barn, done in this kind of, it borders on Cezanne and Chagall, and perhaps he has been looking at some Russian painters as well. There were some affiliations through the Art Association promoting some other artists. And, this is what he was showing at the Art Association, not an advertisement or a pirate painting.
I love that the barn painting is from 1928. That's 2 years after Esherick's studio is first built, in which he takes inspiration from this kind of Pennsylvania bank barn. He was very interested in that kind of vernacular architecture. And so these points of connection sort of in the themes, and I imagine him looking at this in the exhibition in the 1930s
gosh.
and linking
Yeah.
it back to that interest.
Yeah, NC's Pennsylvania barn is kind of, you know, leaning and listing and swooping and swirling and in motion, and then Wharton Esherick actually builds a building that does that.
Exactly, right? It's designed to look as though it sort of is in motion. So maybe this is closer to the studio than,
Yeah.
than we might have anticipated.
Yeah.
I love this article here. Most of Chester County art prizes won by Wyeth families. So they really dominated in 1933, with the exception, I love this, the last paragraph here. Andrew, son of N.C. Wyeth, received second award in the black and white class. His picture, New England, was surpassed by the black and white of the famous etcher, Wharton Esherick, Plowing. Plowing is in the exhibition at Brandywine now. Just such a funny point of connection, right? Where the Esherick and the Wyeths and Esherick were sort of back and forth with each other in these sort of different ways.
Yeah, I find that a lot when I read these historical reviews of exhibitions. It's basically like, great, the Wyeths are here. Are you going to leave any prizes for anybody else, people? And Esherick was in competition, so to speak, not only with NC, who was his peer, but with NC's children, who were up and coming and often taking the prizes at these local associations as well.
So just one more note about the Chester County Art Association and the works that are in the Brandywine exhibition. The Race is one of those pieces that you can come and see if you go to the Brandywine now. And this was shown in the subsequent year, 1934's installation for the Chester County Art, for the Art Association, where the review in the Inquirer said, Wharton Esherick's cubistic horse race, eloquent of speed, together with abstract sculpture by the same artists, are used as bits of decoration against a background of red and black. So we kind of get a sense of not only what was included in the exhibition, but also what the sort of overall space might have looked like. We want to move on to talk about the world of illustration and how Esherick and Wyeth both have sort of grounding there, even though Wyeth is really much more known for making that a home. Esherick started his professional career as an illustrator. I'm showing on the left an illustration he did in 1906, so he still would have been sort of a student then in pen and ink. He worked at the North American, which was a daily Philadelphia newspaper. After leaving PAFA, he copied photos of baseball players, celebrities, and train wrecks. And then he illustrated ads and articles at the Evening Bulletin, the Public Ledger, and then in 1911 became an artist for the Victor Talking Machine Company, making $15 a week, making drawings from photographs that were then converted to silkscreen stencils. And so I'm showing the kinds of advertising that the Victor Talking Machine Company was publishing in that very year. Esherick took this sort of illustrative sensibility into personal projects too. These are 2 pages from a log that he made documenting his honeymoon, which he did. It was a sailing honeymoon, a sailing trip up the Atlantic coast. I'm thinking back to, Amanda, your sort of notion that NC is developing his house to look like a ship. A lot of the design of the studio for Esherick comes from the sort of ways that small spaces in ships are constructed. But these fantastic illustrations here done in ink on paper to document the sort of wild ride of his and Letty's honeymoon. Esherick was also
I am totally unaware of N.C. Wyeth illustrating his honeymoon.
Maybe we'll do some research and we'll find out.
Find it.
Esherick was also illustrating books later in his career. This is the first book that he illustrated, The Rhymes of Early Jungle Folk. He did 74 woodcuts for this children's primer on evolution done by the socialist author Mary Marcy. That was really his first publication. He contributed illustrations largely in woodcut to a variety of magazines here from the Century in 1923, but also publishing in Vanity Fair, The New Republic, The Dial. Most of his book illustrations, though, were done for books published by Philadelphia's Centaur Press, which is an offshoot of the Centaur Bookshop. I'm showing the exterior of that building in Philadelphia in the 1930s, and then a print that Esherick did of the bookshop in 1925. The first book that Centaur published was in 1924 was Walt Whitman's Song of the Broad Axe. I'm showing that here on the left, and there are illustrations from Song of the Broad Axe in the Brandywine show. The last book that Esherick did for them, and he did 9 in total, with illustrations for Thwarted Ambitions. So the advertisement here, done by Robert Lane Anderson, the son of Sherwood Anderson, who was a good friend of Esherick's. And then that wonderful illustration plowing that we saw besting Andrew Wyeth in the competition before. This is what it would have looked like in the its original context in the publication that the Centaur Press produced.
You know, it makes me wonder if N.C. Wyeth, I mean, I'm speculating here, but Wharton Esherick was really being successful at combining his artistic worlds, that he could take something that he was using as an illustration for a book in the Centaur Press, and he was hanging it in an exhibition and getting an award for it without it being labeled illustration, right? And, you know, N.C. Wyeth, I think, would have really admired that if he had taken note of it, because that was something he struggled with his whole career. So,
well, I think it's the difference too between sort of these art books, like books that are made in limited edition as art objects as much as they are publications, versus a mass
Saturday
market
Evening
book
Post.
that's out there or the Saturday Evening Post. Exactly.
Yeah. So just, I mean, I wanted Emily to talk more about Esherick's illustration career, because it's such a lesser known part of his career. Illustration is not a lesser known of N.C. Wyeth's career, but just to give you the basics, the foundation of it, remember I had mentioned he came to Howard Pyle in Wilmington in 1902. Howard Pyle was encouraging his students to paint what they knew well, or know well what they were painting. So it was part of them, and they knew it backwards and forwards. So N.C. Wyeth really thought he was going to be a painter of the American West. And this is a lot of his early work was focusing around cowboys, Western culture, the frontier. And his very first Saturday Evening Post cover, I think it's his very first published illustration, period. And so imagine getting the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, was from February 1903. So not long after he had started taking classes. So you see the painting itself, Bronco Buster, and how it appeared on the Post's cover. So not a full finished realized with the background, just this iconic image of the cowboy on the Bronco. And then if you go to the next, still in the early works. Now, remember, this is 1906. So just about the time that Wharton Esherick is working for the North American, and he's doing the baseball images and working for the Victor, what was it? The Victor Sound Machine Company?
Victor Talking Machine, his master's voice, right? That great advertisement.
Yeah, so that very forward-thinking modern thing. N.C. Wyeth is illustrating for Cream of Wheat. And this is a little bit of a point of contention. As you were mentioning, Emily, the idea of art books and things that were made to be respected and art forms of themselves, Howard Pyle had a little chip on his shoulder, I think, for some of his students that would do, and he used the phrase breakfast cereal illustrations. And then it was hard to not imagine him talking about N.C. Wyeth, who was illustrating Cream of Wheat at the time, but saying that you had to select products that were like the Victor Talking Machines or Edison light bulbs. That's what Maxfield Parrish did. But N.C. Wyeth found a great market for his Western themed things in down-home Americana, like Cream of Wheat soup, or on the next two images, Lucky Strike tobacco and Coca-Cola. So this is throughout his life. You saw that the 1906, 1920s, 1930s, 1936, his Coca-Cola ads here. So he had these two sides, something more artistic like Pennsylvania Barn. At the same time, he's doing Coca-Cola ads as well. Okay, you can go on. What's next? Oh, well, and not to mention, NC, had this really great career and relationship that kicked off with Scribner's with 1911's Treasure Island and continued to do so many other things like The Black Arrow and Robin Hood and Kidnapped and Last of the Mohicans. But as I was going through and selecting, which example should I show? Well, the one on the left is a really popular painting. It fell upon a thorn, it hung upon a thorn, and that's in our galleries right now, but I'm spreading them all out in my digital slide sorter. And I realized that N.C. Wyeth is painting in Chad's Ford, and that's a Chad's Ford tree, and that's a Chad's Ford tree, and that's a Chad's Ford tree. I think it's the same tree 3 times over, just from slightly different angles. NC, despite the fact he's painting Sherwood Forest or, medieval England or anything like this, he is in his own landscape, using his own surroundings. And it makes me think back to that very impressionistic painting where these trees are dominant figures in the landscape. And he kind of enacts the action of the book in front of the backdrop of Chad's Ford. And I feel like that respect for the wood and the respect for the landscape is something he really shares with N.C. Wyeth, with Wharton Esherick as well.
So the role of books in both of these men's life was profound, whether they were making them or consuming them. And we kind of wanted to zero in on an author who was a presence in both of their lives, albeit in very different ways. Esherick was an avid reader. He had well-documented friendships with writers. I'm showing here his bedroom, which includes over 600 books and magazines. We have them all cataloged, so we really know what he was digging into. Amongst his favorites was Henry David Thoreau. And so I'm showing here Esherick's copy and then heavily annotated versions of it, where Esherick was clearly kind of going through and engaging with the text. His notes on Thoreau are more substantial than any other author in his library. He also had not just Thoreau's writings, but his good friend Theodore Dreiser, who is depicted in the print of A Great City that's now in the Brandywine exhibition. Dreiser presenting the living thoughts of Thoreau in the Living Thoughts Library. So this is a sort of series of books where the thinkers of our time, the great thinkers, are distilled for the busy, intelligent readers who don't have the time to sort through the voluminous works of said authors. So he's got the full Thoreau, and then he's got his friend's a sort of explanation of Thoreau, which I think is just fantastic. And then, of course, Thoreau is held up as this model for the lifestyle that Esherick would go on to lead, this sort of going out to the country, the lone craftsman in the woods. And so here in this spread from American Craft Horizons magazine, then in 1959, when Esherick was having what was the first solo exhibition of a living artist at the new Craft Museum in New York, it opens with the line, "He's been called a Thoreau of our time, Dean of American Craftsmen, contemporary Chippendale poet and sculptor." So Thoreau is not only somebody he's very interested in, but the sort of model for the lifestyle. And N.C. Wyeth, of course, has a fascination with Thoreau as well.
I know, starting from he had family, remember he's from Needham, Massachusetts. He had family members that knew Thoreau. And so this was always a hero of N.C. Wyeth's. And of course, he illustrated not only books about and regarding Thoreau, like Men Have Conquered, and you see 2 examples here, Thoreau and Miss Mary Emerson of 1936, and Thoreau and 3 Reformers, also 1936. He also, now I have to go and look to see if NC had Theodore Dreiser's version of Thoreau in his library, because NC's library is also voluminous. And we have shown recently some of his copies of Thoreau in an exhibition about Andrew Wyeth, entitled Every Leaf and Twig, that kind of explored the family, specifically Andrew's passion for nature and for Thoreau. The great happiness of NC's life was that his son Andrew was born on Thoreau's birthday. And so this was, something much to be celebrated. Can you go to the next 2, Emily? I thought this Thoreau fishing actually reminded me a lot of the Coca-Cola ad that was also going on in 1936, but this is the more personal painting. And you'd seen earlier in our presentation, one of N.C. Wyeth's versions of Walden Pond Revisited, a 1930s exhibition that he exhibited here in at the Chester County Art Association. Well, it was a passionate painting for him, and he revisited it in the 1940s. And he did a tempera version of it, so a little bit different. The other image I'm showing you here is just in the last couple of weeks, we've been requested to have that image appear on a new volume about Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau in the Nick of Time, that's going to be coming out next year. And we've been working with the publisher and the designer, and you see the 1942 version is still being used. N.C. Wyeth is still being used to illustrate Thoreau works to today. Emily, do you think we should, do you think?
No, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, do you think that we should skip to the museum part when we're?
I think that makes sense. So
Yeah.
we're gonna move ahead a little bit here.
Yeah, and because we do want to have time for questions. Yeah.
We do. And so I think we wanted to sort of conclude our conversation today talking about how both of these studios became museums, right? These were both homes at one point. These were both spaces where artists lived and worked. I'm showing Esherick's home and studio, the back view here, sort of set into the landscape, this sort of paragon of organic architecture. And then the interior here, where we are so lucky today that when you come to the studio, everything is almost just as Esherick left it. We like to say that sort of it is as though Esherick stepped out to have coffee and might be back any moment, because all of the objects that he lived within, he lived and surrounded himself with, are there in the space. And one of the ways that sort of came to be is that Esherick knew before the end of his life that the studio was going to be turned into a public-facing museum. And so there was no moment when Esherick's home and the sort of world that he created for himself was at risk of sort of some things going here, some things going there. The family was in it from the beginning in order to sort of turn this into a public space. And they brought sort of the artist in on that in his lifetime. The museum was founded by Esherick's daughter, Ruth, and son-in-law, Bob Bascom. I'm showing here on the left, Ruth Esherick Bascom, outside Esherick's 1956 workshop. This is the collaborative building that he made with Ann Ting and Lou Kahn. After Esherick passed, Bob and Ruth moved into that workshop and made it their home for decades so that they could live on site and run the museum and sort of be there to welcome people into the space. And then, so Ruth is there outside what was her father's workshop, what was then became her home. And then an image of the 10th anniversary of the museum in 1982. So we've just celebrated our 50th anniversary not too long ago with Bob and Ruth and Miriam Phillips, Esherick's partner at the end of his life, and then Marvin Schwartz, a Brooklyn Museum curator who he was close with. And so the family is really at the foundation of making sure that this space not only became a public-facing space, but also that all of the objects sort of stayed there, that we do have a collection now of approximately 3,000 objects that Esherick lived and worked and surrounded himself with.
And I'm just going to sort of reinforce what Emily just said. The family is also at the root of how N.C. Wyeth's home and studio, and then later Andrew Wyeth's studio, became museum spaces, became part of our property here. So I'm taking you back to 1921 and the Wyeth clan as it was in 1921. N.C. Wyeth passed away in a car accident in 1945. So it was sudden. No one knew it was coming. No one had made plans for what would happen after his death, because he was still a thriving and active artist, taking on commissions. What we have here is Life magazine was sent out, Alfred Newman, to do photographs within the studios 3 years after NC died. And I know you can't tell much by this photograph, but 3 years later and nothing had changed. In fact, Carolyn Wyeth, the 1, 2, 3, third from the left in that photograph, had gone into the studio on the day her father died and had set aside his palette and marked it with the date and said, do not touch. And so the palette is there as he left it on the day he died. So in many ways, the studio is preserved to be 1945 and what was going on in 1945, even though there were other things, the studio changed shape, there were different projects happening. There was that sense of preservation of that moment. The house itself is interpreted to different periods. So the studio is one. What happened with the N.C. Wyeth house is that gradually each of the family members moved away. In fact, in this photograph, Peter Hurd and Henriette Wyeth are represented by paintings propped on top of that bookshelf because they had already moved to New Mexico. But it was Carolyn Wyeth, the daughter who had preserved that palette, who was the last remaining family member in the house. Mrs. N.C. Wyeth there in the center had passed away in, I think, 73. So again, very, very on par with Wharton Esherick's world. But it had already been decided that Carolyn Wyeth would stay in the house and have life rights to the house and to the studio where she did teach classes. She did invite people in. And that's why the studio has changed over the years. And that's why the house has changed over the years. The studio was sort of set back to 1945. By the time Carolyn passed away in 1994, the entire house, the entire studio, and the contents of all of them were bequeathed to the Brandywine in 1996. So it has been a museum since the last Wyeth walked out the door.
So with that, we've given you a sort of plethora of connections. We know that there are likely more that we are unaware of, and we hope that we'll learn more as the exhibition continues to be at the Brandywine. But I think, Amanda, we have some time to take questions. Unfortunately, if I leave the images up, I cannot see the chat, so I'm gonna rely on you.
I got the chat up, right? Exactly, and so. Let's see, I'm just, any connection between Andrew Wyeth and Esherick in the later years? I feel like our friends at the Wyeth Study Center would be better suited to this, but I can tell you on the surface, none that we know of, no letters, communications beyond that, a potential, acknowledgement of him, but not just as a frame maker, but Betsy Wyeth was a real collector of American historic furniture. And she collected more historically. So I'm not sure if Wharton Esherick would have been her taste, so to speak. She was collecting Native American materials, early American furniture. So might not have fallen within her taste. But we can certainly ask our friends at the Wyeth Study Center to go through if they've ever come up with it. Read the cats in the frame with the nautical theme. Cats were kept on ships to control the rodents. Oh, Denise Smith. That sounds right. And actually, if I go to the original source material, we might find that, the image he was illustrating, there was like a little friendly cat on the ship or something like that. Despite the fearsome pirates, the cat may have played a role. How did it come to be the idea of showing some Esherick pieces at Brandywine, and why? Emily?
Well, this is... I will say that the idea didn't come because we had this plethora of information about the connections, right? This has come after. It sort of came out of an interest in showing a selection of Esherick's prints. We were going to do a small print show. There was a visit between the director of the Brandywine and to the Esherick Museum, and sort of conversation started. And as we began to put the sort of think about what this could be, it got bigger and bigger and bigger because of these moments of connection, because of these themes, because of the way that Esherick's career and life reflected the Brandywine's collections, and its sort of site as an institution that has both formal gallery space, which the Esherick Museum does not have, and understands how to steward an artist studio. And so when we were thinking about who might be a partner for bringing our collection out into the world, some of those works have not left the studio since it became a museum in 1972. Some of them haven't left ever. So we really were excited not just about these kinds of thematic connections, biographical connections, but also the Brandywine's deep knowledge of how to balance the sort of traditional museum gallery spaces with this stewardship of artist studio space as public space.
Yes, and when you say some of those things have never left the studio, I'm reminded while looking at this photograph that everybody, if you're feeling kind and generous, that painting in the center of N.C. Wyeth, his self-portrait and top hat, it's about to be up for auction, and we would gladly take it as a gift and welcome it back to the studio and the museum. I don't have a spare $500,000, though. Let me check here.
Comes to your aid.
Yeah. And then I think, yeah, there was another question at the beginning about asking whether they hung in the same artistic crowd. And I think as far as we can tell, you know, meetings of the Chester County Art Association, the exhibitions, the openings, in some ways, yes, it's a small art world, but then, you know, I also noticed that we contained our remarks here to Chester County Art Association, but there were times when reviews of shows in Philadelphia and the same Philadelphia Inquirer were mentioning the N.C. Wyeth's hanging here and the Wharton Esherick's hanging there. So they were the artists that were being talked about in the city, in especially the 1930s. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be so interesting to really delve into that and find the whole exhibition records and compare and contrast. But I think it's safe to say that if you were an art lover in the 1920s and the 30s and you were going to exhibitions in Philadelphia, you were familiar with both of these artists.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we would love to find
juicy letters between the two of them. That would be great.
Hey, NC. Hey, Wharton. Hey, would you like to come over for dinner one evening? But we do not have those. I mean, they certainly.
Although if anyone who's on the call and is sitting on a cache of letters, please let us know. We'd love to see them.
Yes. And I think I will just, Mary, if you are out there, is there anything we need to wrap up other than letting folks know that this has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube. We will be sending it to you. We thank you all for joining us.
We had one more question, Amanda.
Yeah. Oh, we do.
Emily might want to take about Esherick's prints of farm landscapes and how close they are to landscapes by Grant Wood. Are there any connections?
Oh.
Yeah, like the different months of the year, the Grant Wood.
I mean, it's Esherick did depict landscapes at different moments in time. That December image that I shared with you, we've also got January, we've also got February. I mean, Esherick was observing the land. His neighbors were farmers. He was connected with the sort of artisans and craftsmen and farmers who worked the land in his community. So while I don't know that there's a specific point of connection between Esherick and Grant Wood, Esherick's depictions of farmland were very much rooted in place, in connections with people, and in what he observed as he was not only sort of stewarding his own land, but also watching the changes to the farms around him through the 1920s, 1930s.
And because some of those Grant Wood prints were really widely available through Associated American Artists, it was not only more likely that Esherick would see them, but Esherick's patrons, Esherick's circle of people who would purchase his work or commission him to do work would have been familiar as well. And I think the idea of them being in the same boat of observing and in their heavily stylized way, it's not a coincidence stylistic.
What I would love to do is head back to our catalog of Esherick's library and take a look and see what Grant Wood publications were in there, because I imagine there might be some. And so maybe that's something that we can do on the back end of this call.
I know, honestly, every one of the historic artist homes and studios should have a meeting where we compare the catalogs of our libraries and say, was your artist reading about my artist? Was your artist writing about my artist?
That would be fascinating, and it would be a tangled web, I think.
One quick question to end, Emily, about whether Esherick knew George Nakashima.
We get this question a lot. Esherick and Nakashima knew each other. They were not necessarily the biggest fans of each other. So, you know, they had very different sort of personalities, and but did know of each other's work. And one of the pieces of evidence we have for that is a letter in our collection where someone wrote to George Nakashima saying, I saw a photo of your studio, your home, in a magazine. It had that fantastic staircase. I would love to try to build my own. Can you send me plans for it? Which is already a kind of wild ask. Nakashima wrote on the bottom of the letter, I think you're talking about Wharton Esherick, and he forwarded the letter to Esherick, and now it's in our archives. So he knew enough about Esherick to know that magnificent staircase that this author was referring to was not his, but Wharton's.
Oh, painful to be confused with another artist.
All right, well, thanks to you both for such a wonderful program. We've gotten many comments about what a lively discussion this was. I agree. You can see there's more research to be done. I want to thank the Historic Artist Homes and Studio group of the National Trust for promoting this program. And we're excited to learn more. When you find out more, please, let's have part 2.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone.